On May 14, 1859, in Savannah, Georgia, a girl was led onto an auction block and the city forgot how to breathe. Men who had bought human beings for half their lives suddenly went quiet. Women raised in polished houses lowered their eyes. 3 of the richest families in coastal Georgia came ready to bid, ready to own, ready to display their power the way powerful people always do when the law is written for them. But then the girl smiled. Just once. And that single expression did what sermons, courts, and graves had failed to do. It forced memory back into the room, because her face did not belong only to her. It echoed another woman. A woman who was supposed to be dead. A woman whose name had been scrubbed from ledgers, buried under lies, and pushed out of respectable history by people who profited from both slavery and silence. This is not a story about beauty. It is a story about evidence, about what powerful families will do when the past returns in living form, and about the kind of crime that does not stay buried, no matter how carefully Savannah tried to pave over it. If you listen closely, that auction tells you everything. Not about the girl they tried to sell, but about the people who were terrified to buy her. Savannah liked to dress its crimes in elegance. By the spring of 1859, the city had already perfected that habit. The squares were neat, the churches were full. The cotton money moved with confidence through counting houses, law offices, private clubs, and parlors lit by imported glass. Men spoke of order, civilization, and Christian duty while building fortunes on auctions, chained labor, and the permanent theft of black life. That was the truth beneath the polish. And on May 14, 1859, that truth nearly split open in public. The location was the Ellis and Wainwright yard off Factor's Walk, close enough to the river that the air carried damp salt, mud, and the smell of commerce. People remembered places like that only when it became convenient to call them unfortunate relics. But in 1859 they were not relics. They were active machinery. Flesh was priced there. Families were separated there. Futures were erased there. Every plank and nail in those auction yards existed to turn human beings into paper and profit. That morning, witnesses described an unusual crowd gathering before noon. Not because an auction in Savannah was rare, it was not. The crowd grew because word had been moving since dawn through warehouses, kitchens, carriage paths, and back doors. A girl was being brought in from a coastal holding property, and she was unlike any enslaved girl the traders had handled in years. Her sale name was listed as Eliza Bell, age 16. Sound, trainable, domestic quality, exceptional appearance. That language alone tells you the filth of the system. A child is reduced to condition, utility, and surface. Her terror becomes market language. Her body becomes a line item. And yet, even that obscene description did not capture why people came. They came because beauty under slavery was not a blessing. It was a risk signal. It attracted appetite, speculation, jealousy, and rumors of hidden blood. A beautiful black girl in a southern auction yard did not merely invite bids. She provoked questions nobody respectable wanted asked too loudly. Eliza was brought out just after 11. She wore a pale dress too thin for dignity and too carefully chosen to be accidental. Traders understood staging. They knew how to present youth as innocence, strength as obedience, and suffering as quiet value. Her wrists were not visibly shackled on the platform, which in itself was part of the performance. The yard wanted grace where there had been force, composure where there had been confinement. The lie had to look clean before the bidding began. Men in the front row shifted the moment they saw her. One account, preserved later in a private letter, said she had the bearing of someone raised too near refinement. Another described her posture as unnervingly self-possessed. That detail matters. Enslaved people were expected to appear broken in specific, useful ways. Traders preferred fear they could control, grief they could interpret, silence they could market as submission. Eliza gave them something else. She stood straight. She looked outward. She did not plead. She did not perform panic for white comfort. That alone would have unsettled the room. But it was her face that changed the air. The auctioneer, Silas Wainwright, began with the usual filth dressed as business. Good age, sound teeth, quick hands. Suitable for household placement, possible premium acquisition. The language rolled out in practiced rhythm. It always did. Men like Wainwright survived by speaking horror in the tone of inventory. That is one of slavery's oldest tricks, not merely committing evil, but teaching generations to describe it as administration. The first serious bidder was Augustus Rothwell, 53, shipping investor, creditor, and patron of at least 2 church restoration funds. Savannah knew his public face well. Respectable jacket, measured voice. Generous when the newspapers were watching. The second was Judge Nathaniel Mercer, 61, whose name carried weight in probate disputes and property challenges across Chatham County. The third was Henri St. Clair, a Louisiana-born planter with Savannah business ties, land money, and a reputation for buying what others hesitated to touch. 3 wealthy families. 3 different empires. One girl. The opening figures rose quickly. 1,200, 14, 16, 18. The numbers mattered because they marked abnormal demand. Even by the brutal economics of the late 1850s, this was becoming spectacle. A teenage girl was being valued not only for labor, but for proximity to elite domestic space, for beauty, for status, and for whatever unspoken calculations rich families made when they believed possession could also mean control. Then something happened that no clean historical summary could ever explain away. Eliza looked toward the cluster where the Rothwells stood, then toward Mercer, then toward St. Clair, not the scattered glance of a frightened child, not random movement. She looked as if she recognized the architecture of power in front of her, and then she smiled. Not brightly, not gratefully, not with warmth. It was a small smile, brief, almost private, the kind that seemed to say, "I know something and so do you." The effect was immediate. Rothwell's expression dropped first. Several witnesses later noted that he seemed to lose color in the face. Mercer, who had raised his hand only seconds earlier, lowered it and did not lift it again. Henri St. Clair turned so sharply toward his wife that one onlooker assumed there had been an insult. There had been something far worse than insult. There had been recognition, because this was not the first face like Eliza's those families had seen. Years earlier, in June 1842, a woman named Rose Duval moved in and out of the shadow record surrounding the same social circle, mixed race, enslaved, described in household notes as unusually literate, discreet, and fit for inside service. That phrase, too, deserves to be remembered for what it really meant. Women like Rose were brought close to dining rooms, bedrooms, nurseries, and offices, not because the white families saw them as human, but because proximity created convenience. Convenience for domestic labor, convenience for secrecy, convenience for exploitation that could be hidden behind curtains, legal language, and Christian performance. By August 1842, Rose Duval's trace began to blur. A physician's account book listed nighttime visits to a residence tied indirectly to Mercer interests. A damaged inventory page from early 1843 referred to temporary transfer without destination. A church women's committee note written months later mentioned the unfortunate girl who will not be spoken of again. Then nothing stable, no honest burial record. No verified sales south, no lawful manumission, just disappearance. And now, on a public auction platform in Savannah on May 14, 1859, a girl with Rose Duval's mouth, Rose Duval's eyes, Rose Duval's expression, and perhaps Rose Duval's memory in her blood was standing under the sun, while 3 families who should have been strangers to one another's private sins suddenly behaved like accomplices. Do not tell yourself that such men were shocked by conscience. They were shocked by exposure. There is a difference, and history suffers every time people pretend otherwise. Men like Rothwell and Mercer and St. Clair did not build fortunes by developing souls at the last minute. If they stopped bidding, it was not because they saw Eliza's humanity, it was because they saw danger. Danger to inheritance, danger to household names, danger to old arrangements among powerful men who had once shared access to the same enslaved woman and assumed the evidence had died with her. In slave societies, blood was both obsession and threat. White families preached purity while producing evidence against themselves in private. They enforced racial hierarchy in law while violating it in bedrooms, back rooms, carriage houses, and overseers' quarters. Then they turned around and punished black mothers and black children for the very crossings white men themselves had engineered through coercion. That is not contradiction. That is the system functioning exactly as intended. The auction yard began to murmur. Wainwright attempted to recover control, repeating Eliza's listed qualities, pushing for renewed bids, pressing the urgency of the sale, but the fever had broken. Something colder replaced it. Some in the crowd sensed scandal without understanding its shape. Others understood enough to look away. Savannah's upper class depended on selective ignorance. People survived socially by knowing when not to look too hard at familiar faces. Eliza did not lower her eyes. That detail survives because it offended the room. The expected script had failed. She was supposed to be sold, removed, absorbed into somebody's house, and silenced by distance. Instead, for one impossible moment, she stood at the center of white wealth and made it flinch. Remember that. Remember that the platform was built to strip her of identity, yet identity was the very thing that halted the sale. Remember also what kind of city Savannah was in 1859. Not innocent, not confused, not tragically divided, but organized. Organized around profit, organized around race, organized around the protection of men whose respectability depended on other people's voicelessness. The crime here was not only what may have been done to Rose Duval. The crime was the entire civic arrangement that made such a woman disappear cleanly on paper while those tied to her remained patrons, judges, and gentlemen. By the time the bidding stalled completely, the crowd had witnessed something rare. Power refusing purchase because purchase risked confession. And in that silence, the first crack appeared, because once three wealthy families all stopped bidding on the same girl for the same unspoken reason, the question is no longer whether a secret exists. The question is how many crimes were required to keep it buried. If you're listening from anywhere in the world, comment your city and country below. I want to see how far this story travels, because the crimes buried in Savannah were never meant to stay in Savannah. 17 years before Eliza Bell stepped onto that auction block in Savannah, another woman had already been marked for removal. Her name was Rose Duval. Not in the clean, proud way white families preserve the names of wives, sons, and respectable daughters. Not in marble. Not in parish rolls protected for generations. Rose's name survived the way enslaved women's names often survived in the American South. Fractured across ledgers, misspelled in inventories, reduced to function in household notes, and then deliberately thinned out when her existence became inconvenient to powerful people. That thinning began in June 1842. At the time, Savannah was presenting itself as disciplined, prosperous, and morally upright. Cotton moved through the port in obscene quantities. Shipping houses expanded. Law offices handled inheritance disputes worth fortunes. Churches filled every Sunday with men who quoted scripture after spending the week profiting from stolen labor. The city liked to imagine itself refined, but refinement in slave society was usually just brutality with polished shoes. Rose Duval first appears clearly in a domestic transfer memorandum dated June 3, 1842, attached to a set of household accounts linked indirectly to the Mercer family. She is listed as Rose, age about 24, quadroon, capable seamstress, literate enough for dictated correspondence, suitable for inside service. Every word in that line is a fingerprint of the system. Race quantified, intelligence made useful, skill turned into pricing logic. Humanity erased under the language of management, inside service. Those two words deserve suspicion. Women assigned to kitchens, laundry rooms, nurseries, and parlor-adjacent duties were often described that way. But in the records of wealthy Southern families, inside service could also mean something more guarded. It could mean a woman kept physically close to the core of the household, close enough to overhear family disputes, close enough to manage private needs, close enough to be exploited without witnesses from the fields, close enough that her body became part of the hidden machinery of white respectability. Rose was not an ordinary domestic servant rotating through anonymous labor. By late June 1842, her name appears again, this time in a shipping ledger tied to Augustus Rothwell's commercial office on Bay Street. Not as cargo, not as sale property, as a notation under household disbursements, garments and provisions delivered to Duval woman by instruction. No explanation. No surname for the instruction giver, no listed destination. But the pattern matters. A woman connected first to Mercer Records now receives provisions through channels linked to Rothwell's house. That is not routine bookkeeping. That is coordination. 3 weeks later, on July 19, 1842, a physician's account book kept by Dr. Elias Pemberton records evening visits on consecutive nights to a cottage property outside the main social district, a property later found to be leased under a shell arrangement associated with Henri St. Clair's business interests. The patient is not named in full. The line reads only, RD, female, recurring weakness, agitation, to be observed discreetly. Discreetly. The word sits there like a confession wearing gloves. When powerful men want a matter handled discreetly, it is usually because open handling would expose either shame or crime. In slave society, the line between the two was often decided entirely by white convenience. What exactly was Rose to these families? Publicly nothing important. That is how the lie was maintained. But private traces suggest something more dangerous. Rose appears near all three households within the same 6-week period in the summer of 1842. She is clothed at Rothwell expense, logged under Mercer-linked service records, examined on a property connected to St. Clair. That is not the movement pattern of an ordinary enslaved woman assigned to a single owner's domestic routine. That is the pattern of someone being managed, shared, hidden, or negotiated over. And once that possibility is admitted, the moral shape of the story becomes uglier than polite history usually allows. Because slavery did not only traffic labor, it trafficked access. It allowed elite men to move black women between houses, functions, and forms of violation while the law protected the men, not the women. A woman like Rose could be educated just enough to be useful, kept near enough to be vulnerable, and erased quickly enough to leave no stable claim behind. That was not a malfunction. That was the architecture. By August 1842, the records start to collapse. A page from a household inventory book, partially water-damaged but legible in fragments, shows a line reading, "Rose removed until further notice." No destination, no sale amount, no buyer, no plantation assignment, just removed. The passive voice is important. Slavery loved passive voice. It hid the hand behind the act. Women were removed. Children were placed. Matters were handled. Bodies were transferred. The language was designed to make crime sound like weather. Then there is the church problem. Savannah's respectable families depended on church records to give order to their public narratives. Baptisms, marriages, funerals, charity notices. These were the paper garments worn by a city desperate to appear decent. Yet when Rose supposedly died of fever, as later family lore would claim, no stable burial entry appears under her name in any parish record that survives scrutiny. There is no clear funeral notation in September 1842, no church burial fee, no verified minister's entry consistent with the timeline later repeated in household memory. Instead, there is a smaller, uglier clue. In an auxiliary women's committee notebook from October 1842, one line appears in the margin beside an unrelated charity entry. The unfortunate girl is not to be mentioned again in company. No full name. No explanation, no signature beyond initials believed to belong to Mrs. Constance Mercer. That is how powerful families often buried scandal, not by disproving it, but by giving social instructions around silence. Do not mention her again in company. That line tells you Rose was known. Not merely by servants, by white women inside elite households, known enough to threaten conversation, known enough that someone felt the need to formally stop her name from circulating. People often imagine slaveholding households as neatly divided between guilty men and sheltered women. That is a comforting lie. Many women inside those houses understood far more than they later admitted. They may not have authored every crime, but they frequently became custodians of silence, supervisors of appearances, and enforcers of forgetting. When the survival of the family name depended on the disappearance of a black woman, moral innocence became a costume. By the start of 1843, Rose Duval is nearly gone from paper. No legal sale southbound can be verified, no manumission petition, no probate disposal, no transfer tax entry, no authenticated burial. She does not reappear in plantation labor lists under a consistent alias. She is not traceable through jail logs or newspaper runaway notices with confidence. For a woman who had moved close to the center of three powerful households, that disappearance is not proof of irrelevance. It is proof of deliberate suppression, and suppression always raises the same question: what had to be hidden? One possibility is sexual exploitation so politically dangerous that no single house wanted official possession of the consequences. Another is pregnancy. Another is a child whose existence would disturb more than one lineage. In slave society, those possibilities were not rare. What was rare was a situation involving enough overlapping interests that three wealthy families appeared to cooperate in silence. That is what makes Rose Duval more than a vanished servant. She looks less like a victim who slipped through record-keeping cracks and more like a woman pushed into them. A damaged miniature portrait found decades later in a private trunk associated with the St. Clair line complicates the matter further. The paper backing is gone, the edges scorched. but the face remains visible enough to disturb anyone who later saw Eliza Bell in 1859. Oval face. Unusually direct eyes. A restrained mouth that appears on the edge of either warning or contempt. Beauty alone explains nothing. Resemblance explains much more. And resemblance, in slaveholding families, was one of the most feared forms of evidence. Because blood has a way of surviving paper, the rich could alter ledgers, they could pressure ministers, they could pay physicians for discretion, they could move women at night and bury them without names. But they could not fully control the return of a face. They could not prevent a daughter, or a girl believed to be a daughter, from carrying forward the visual accusation her mother once embodied. That is why Rose matters, not because the archive treated her as important. The archive rarely did justice to women like her. She matters because the archive flinches around her, because records go thin when they should go thick, because names vanish where financial and social interests overlap, because people with power suddenly become imprecise when precision would expose them. Remember that habit. It is one of the oldest habits of abusive systems. They become vague exactly where they are most guilty. By June 1842, Rose Duvall is present. By July 1842, she is being handled discreetly. By October 1842, she is not to be mentioned. By early 1843, she is effectively erased. And yet no proper death stands up, no proper sale stands up, no honest ending stands up. So when Savannah's wealthiest families looked at Eliza Bell on May 14, 1859, they were not reacting to a mystery born that morning. They were reacting to a woman they had already tried to remove once before. Rose Duvall had not been remembered because Savannah was decent enough to preserve her story. She had been remembered because guilt is never as tidy as the guilty hope. Her trace remained in fragments, in frightened notations, in doctored absences, in the social instructions of white families who knew exactly when a black woman's name had become dangerous. And that is the lesson worth holding on to here. A city can hide a body. A family can suppress a scandal. A church can swallow a name. A ledger can lie. But when power works that hard to erase one woman, it is usually because she stood too close to the truth. And Rose Duvall, by every sign left behind, stood close enough to burn 3 houses at once. By the spring of 1859, Savannah liked to pretend that power was orderly. It was not. It was connected. That is the first thing worth fixing in the record. People speak of old Southern families as if each house operated behind its own gate, with its own code, its own lineage, its own private sins. That is a useful myth for descendants and local historians who prefer scandal in small, manageable portions. But in cities like Savannah, wealth moved in circles, not boxes. Money crossed dining tables, courtrooms, church pews, shipping contracts, and marriage arrangements. Men who called one another rivals by daylight often protected one another by dusk. That is how systems of abuse survive, not through isolated monsters but through cooperating elites. The Rothwells, the Mercers, and the St. Clairs did not belong to the same industry by accident. They belonged to the same structure. Augustus Rothwell, born 1806, had built his fortune in shipping credit, warehouse liens, and coastal insurance. He understood cargo, debt, and leverage. He was not the loudest man in Savannah, which made him more dangerous, not less. Men like Rothwell did not need theatrical cruelty. They preferred paper. A signature here, a loan there, a delayed payment, a foreclosed property, a quiet arrangement with a trader. By the 1850s, his office on Bay Street touched enough cotton and rice transactions to influence who rose, who fell, and who stayed dependent. Publicly, he was known as disciplined, pious, and civic-minded. He donated to church repairs in 1854. He subscribed to a hospital fund in 1856. Newspaper language called him steady. The paper often lies politely when money pays the printer. Then there was Judge Nathaniel Mercer, born 1798, older than Rothwell and better shielded by the law. Mercer represented something even more useful than cash: legitimacy. He handled probate disputes, title questions, and inheritance conflicts in and around Chatham County. In a slave society, that kind of authority was not technical. It was moral theater. The law gave theft ceremony. It turned family greed into legal language and human bondage into recognized property. Mercer's value to Savannah's elite was simple. He knew how to make ugly things appear settled. He could translate private vice into public order. Men feared scandal. Mercer specialized in the paperwork that made scandal survivable. Then came Henri St. Clair, the most visibly theatrical of the three. Born in 1812 with plantation holdings tied to Louisiana and commercial ties reaching into coastal Georgia by 1841, St. Clair carried himself with the arrogance of a man accustomed to crossing jurisdictions faster than consequences could follow. He bought land aggressively. He speculated in labor. He acquired people the way others acquired horses or silver, evaluating usefulness, breeding, and resale. He had that particular kind of planter vanity that mistook appetite for sophistication. Savannah tolerated him because he had money, and cities built on slavery rarely rejected money unless it arrived poor. 3 families, 3 styles of power, 1 shared dependency. The system had to stay sealed. By 1859, all 3 houses had too much invested in appearances to survive a living scandal. That is the real meaning of what happened at the auction. The silence was not random, it was structural. Eliza Bell's face threatened not just emotion, but architecture. The Rothwells depended on reputation because credit depends on trust. A merchant can survive rumor more easily than a banker can survive doubt. If questions began to circulate that Augustus Rothwell had been tied to a vanished enslaved woman whose child resurfaced under dubious custody, then business opponents could weaponize morality selectively. Not because Savannah cared about black suffering, it did not, but because respectable men in corrupt cities will gladly exploit one another's corruption when profit demands it. Rothwell knew that. One whisper in the wrong room could infect loans, weaken partnerships, and complicate alliances already built on fragile confidence. The Mercers had a different vulnerability: lineage and legality. Judge Mercer's authority rested on the illusion that his household, his decisions, and his bloodline belonged to the clean side of the social order. A hidden child tied to an enslaved woman was not merely a private embarrassment. It was a legal hazard. Inheritance disputes in the slave South did not become dangerous only when justice appeared. They became dangerous when rival whites found opportunity. If Rose Duval had borne a child connected to Mercer or someone under his protection, then every altered date, every quiet transfer, every missing record carried the risk of later challenge. A man who spent decades judging legitimacy could not afford the rumor that his own world had been built through deliberate illegitimacy. St. Clair faced another danger: exposure through habit. Men like Henri St. Clair left longer trails because they mistook power for immunity. He was known to move labor between properties, known to arrange private holdings through intermediaries, known, in at least one account from 1844, to maintain a leased cottage outside the formal domestic quarters tied to his business network. That sort of arrangement becomes interesting only when names start recurring around it. Rose Duval appears near that shadow. So does medical discretion. So does the timing of her disappearance. A man like St. Clair could survive accusations of lust. Southern elites did that every day. What he could not easily survive was the suggestion of coordination, shared concealment, shared access, shared responsibility. That is where the story darkens further, because the strongest possibility is not that Rose Duval belonged secretly to one of these men. It is that she became a point of overlap among them. People often resist this idea because it sounds too sordid, too organized, too ugly. But ugliness is not disproof. Slave societies created conditions where black women could be circulated through elite households under a dozen respectable pretexts: nursing, sewing, reading correspondence, tending the sick, assisting wives, serving guests, traveling with children. Underneath those tasks sat another reality everyone understood and few documented: proximity invited exploitation. Shared social networks blurred boundaries. A woman without legal personhood could be used, transferred, and silenced more easily than any official narrative later admitted. By June and July of 1842, Rose Duval appears in records that touch all 3 houses. By 1859, Eliza Bell appears before all 3 families at once and stops them cold. That is not coincidence. That is pattern, and pattern matters more than denial. Savannah's elite class also protected itself through marriage webs. A Rothwell niece married into a banking line tied to Mercer creditors in 1851. A St. Clair commercial arrangement intersected with Mercer probate matters by 1853. Shared attendance at the Independent Presbyterian Church and charitable boards put their wives and sisters in the same rooms often enough for silence to become social policy. This is worth saying clearly. Powerful families do not need a written conspiracy when they already share incentives, marriages, clergy, lawyers, and dinner invitations. Social proximity does most of the work. And what did they all have to lose? Inheritance first? Not necessarily, because Eliza Bell could ever have won formal recognition. Slave law was designed to deny black children justice. But because proof does not have to win in court to destroy peace inside a house, a face can do enough. A resemblance can do enough. A whispered date can do enough. Older children begin asking questions. Wives start connecting absences. Rival cousins sniff opportunity. Trusted clerks reconsider old entries. Estates that once seemed orderly acquire shadows. In societies obsessed with blood, the wrong bloodline rumor can poison generations. Second, they had status to lose. Savannah's first families depended less on innocence than on control of the narrative. Their survival required that vice remain private and racial hierarchy remain visible. The system could tolerate assault, coercion, even the existence of mixed-race children, so long as those realities remained compartmentalized, kept in kitchens, quarters, side buildings, or far-off plantations. What it could not tolerate was public recognition. The auction threatened precisely that. It turned a hidden resemblance into an observed event. Too many people saw three powerful families react at once. Once witnesses notice synchronized fear, the wall between rumor and meaning begins to crack. Third, they had legal memory to lose. Not law in the noble sense, law as archive, law as transfer. Law as evidence that might be reopened if anyone cared enough to align dates. If Eliza Bell was around 16 in May 1859, then her birth falls around 1842 or 1843. Exactly the period when Rose Duval's record goes thin. The physician's discreet visits appear, and unexplained movements occur between houses connected to Rothwell, Mercer, and St. Clair. That timeline is not a decoration. It is the spine of the accusation. The richest houses in Savannah did not fear truth because truth was morally powerful. They feared it because it was document adjacent. Remember that distinction. Slavery's defenders were rarely moved by ethical contradiction. They were moved by exposure, expense, and instability. The smile on Eliza Bell's face mattered because it activated all three. It was the visual spark that threatened old paper, old decisions, old lies. Beauty had drawn the crowd, but resemblance endangered the room. There is one more layer that deserves notice. These three families also benefited from appearing separate. Rivalry is a useful mask. It distracts the public from cooperation. Rothwell the merchant, Mercer the judge, St. Clair the planter, different roles, different temperaments, different reputations. But when the same girl unsettles all three, the mask slips. The city sees, however briefly, that the boundaries between commerce, law, and plantation power were never real boundaries at all. They were divisions of labor inside one machine. That machine needed women like Rose Duval to disappear. It needed children like Eliza Bell to remain unnamed. It needed wives to host dinners, ministers to bless order, clerks to stay vague, and judges to call theft stability. Above all, it needed memory to behave. On May 14, 1859, memory did not behave. That is why the auction matters beyond spectacle. It exposed a truth polite. Southern history has spent generations shrinking. The great houses were not merely neighboring beneficiaries of slavery. They were sometimes joint custodians of its dirtiest secrets. When a black woman became inconvenient, they could thin her records. When a child threatened recognition, they could try to move her as merchandise. When a face reappeared, they could fall silent together and hope silence still worked. But silence is not innocence. It is only the sound power makes when it recognizes itself in the crime scene. And that day in Savannah, three of the city's proudest families heard exactly that sound. By the summer of 1843, the secret had changed shape. It was no longer just a woman to be hidden. It was a child. That is where the story becomes even harder for respectable memory to digest, because slaveholding society could survive rumors about exploited women far more easily than it could survive questions about children. A woman could be dismissed as unstable, immoral, or conveniently dead. A child was different. A child carried dates. A child carried resemblance. A child carried the thread of continuity. And continuity is what frightened powerful families most, because it could turn private sin into a living timeline. The first useful trace appears in a notebook not meant for public reading. It was a church relief ledger kept loosely between July and September 1843 by a black midwife and lay helper named Dinah Freeman, a woman who moved between enslaved quarters, birthing rooms, and infirmaries in the Savannah outskirts. Women like Dinah were essential to the South and rarely honored for it. They caught babies, cleaned wounds, managed fevers, buried the fragile, and carried knowledge white households pretended not to need, while depending on it constantly. Their names survived only when somebody feared what they knew. In an entry dated August 21, 1843, Dinah recorded a line that would have meant little to a careless reader and everything to anyone willing to look honestly. Girl child delivered before dawn. Mother not to be named aloud, house not to be marked, payment promised through another hand. That is not a normal birth entry. The missing names are the message. In ordinary informal notations from women like Dinah, people were often identified by at least some social marker: household, owner, location, kin relation, physical condition. Here, every identifying piece is intentionally blurred. Even the payment is separated from the birth through another hand, which means whoever arranged the delivery did not want the money tied directly to the mother or the property where it happened. That is concealment. And concealment around childbirth in 1843 Georgia usually meant one of three things. The child threatened inheritance, the mother threatened reputation, or the father could not safely be named. In this case, the evidence points toward all three. By then, Rose Duval had already been pushed out of stable records for more than a year. That matters. If Rose had truly died in 1842, as later family whispers claimed, there should be no child connected to her in August 1843. Yet the timing fits too neatly with everything else that had already been made vague. Physician visits in July 1842, household transfers without destination, a cottage kept under indirect control, and the growing panic around her name. A pregnancy beginning in mid to late 1842 would place a birth in exactly that late summer 1843 window. This is where decent language often collapses, because what we are dealing with is not merely scandal. It is the afterlife of coercion. Slave societies created children through violence and then built entire legal systems to punish the children for existing. White men could force access, deny paternity, silence mothers, and still remain gentlemen in public. Black women could be used, hidden, relocated, or erased. The child, if inconvenient, would be relabeled and redistributed like any other asset. That is not accidental cruelty. That is administrative evil. Dinah Freeman's notebook is only the beginning. A second clue appears in a freight and movement log from McIntosh County, dated September 3, 1843, listing a private wagon transfer of household goods and one infant female under supervision of a trader's assistant named Caleb Pryor. No mother is listed, no sale price is attached, no tax notation appears alongside it. The destination is obscured by ink damage, but a later annotation suggests the infant was held temporarily near Riceboro before being moved again northward. That is not how openly sold property was usually documented. It looks more like controlled movement, an effort to take a child out of immediate local sight until whatever crisis surrounded her had cooled. And that raises the central accusation. The infant, later called Eliza Bell, may have been hidden not because she was worthless, but because she was too identifiable. A child born to an enslaved woman normally increased the wealth of the enslaver. Under the law, the child inherited the status of the mother. That made enslaved birth economically useful to the people profiting from bondage. So why hide this one? Why move her through back channels? Why detach the birth from the mother's name, the house, and the payer? Why allow years to pass before the girl reappears under a sale name with no stable family line attached? Because not all black children threatened the system equally. Some could be absorbed into it. Some could be sold off quietly. But a child whose face might call attention to more than one elite household posed a different kind of danger. If Rose Duval had borne a daughter whose features pointed too clearly toward one, or worse, several, members of Savannah's white upper world, then the child became both property and evidence. And evidence is always handled more carefully than ordinary property. By late 1843, a second woman enters the margins of the story, Martha Jane Pike, wife of a minor Baptist preacher on the road between Savannah and Bryan County. In a surviving domestic memorandum dated November 1843, she notes receiving a baby girl, brown complexion, quiet but watchful, to be nursed for a season, no questions wanted. The phrase is stark in its indecency. No questions wanted. That was the moral language of slave society in miniature. Need the labor, no questions. Need the woman, no questions. Need the child removed, no questions. It is worth stopping there and naming the deeper offense. People often speak of slavery's brutality in images of whips, chains, and auctions. Those were real, and they matter. But another form of brutality lived in paperwork, euphemism, and small instructions. No questions wanted, not to be named aloud, removed until further notice. Such phrases are the fingerprints of people who knew what they were doing and wanted the record to stay just blurred enough to protect them later. A civilization does not become innocent because it learns to whisper its crimes. The girl appears to have been moved again in 1845, this time into the informal custody of a trader operating near Darien under the name Solomon Bell. That surname matters, not because it proves kinship, but because it may explain the later sale identity Eliza Bell. Traders often assigned or preserved surnames for convenience, camouflage, or bookkeeping continuity. If the child lived under Bell's inventory umbrella for a period, then Bell may have become a practical cover, a neutral label with no obvious link to Mercer, Rothwell, St. Clair, or Duval, a name simple enough to disappear inside the market. By 1850, census-adjacent slave schedules in coastal Georgia show several adolescent girls under trader control with no clear maternal chain. That, by itself, was not unusual. But one ancillary notation from 1851, preserved in a private account ledger, mentions the Bell girl, keep from Savannah houses until instructed. There it is again. The city named as a place of danger, not safety. Not because Savannah was violent in some abstract way. It was. But because certain houses in Savannah had reason to recognize her. The child born in August 1843 had become, by adolescence, a management problem. Now consider the arithmetic. If Eliza Bell was listed around 16 years old on May 14, 1859, then her birth falls squarely within 1842 to 1843. That aligns with Rose Duval's disappearance, the physician's discreet visits, the suspicious household transfers, and Dinah Freeman's entry about an unnamed mother. The timeline is not perfect because people with power worked hard to make it imperfect. But it is coherent. And in historical crime, coherence across damaged records matters more than the tidy certainty descendants usually demand before admitting what their ancestors likely did. There is another ugly implication in the phrase from the TOC, not one household, all three. That does not necessarily mean three biological fathers. It means something more structurally disturbing. The child's existence endangered all three families at once because each had participated in the handling of the mother, the concealment of the birth, or the relocation of the infant. One man may have fathered the child. Another may have financed the hiding. Another may have arranged the papers. In slave societies, guilt often worked that way, distributed enough to protect everyone, concentrated enough to destroy anyone who broke rank. By the mid-1850s, Eliza had grown into the very thing these houses could not afford, a visible reminder. If she resembled Rose, that was already dangerous. If she also carried features recognizable to one of the elite lines surrounding Rose, the danger doubled. By then, wives aged, sons became heirs, daughters married, estates prepared for transition. Old sins that once seemed containable inside one generation began threatening the next. A child hidden in 1843 could, by 1859, walk into a city and disturb every polished lie built since. And that is exactly what happened. She did not arrive at the auction block as a random girl caught by commerce. She arrived as the delayed consequence of a crime nobody had fully resolved. Her body had been moved, renamed, and managed for years, but the system had made one mistake it always makes in the end. It assumed the market could absorb evidence forever. It could not. The child born before dawn in August 1843 was not only born into bondage, she was born into concealment. She was made to live under borrowed labels because her true significance was too dangerous for open paper. That is the kind of beginning slavery specialized in, turning infants into liabilities before they could even speak. Remember that whenever romantic language tries to soften the Old South, remember the unnamed mother, the hidden payment, the infant female moved without lawful clarity, the nursing arranged under silence, the trader's surname used as cover. The city kept at distance until the right people thought the danger had faded. None of that is mystery for mystery's sake. It is method. It is how power handles children it helped create but cannot afford to acknowledge. So when Eliza Bell stood in Savannah in May 1859, she was not merely the ghost of Rose Duval. She was the child the system had spent 16 years trying to turn into nobody. And yet there she was, alive, visible, and old enough for her face to start telling the truth before any document dared to. Men like these did not stop bidding out of mercy. That is the first lie that must be denied. When wealthy white families in Savannah, Georgia, suddenly lowered their hands on May 14, 1859, they did not do so because a black girl's humanity finally struck them. They had lived too long inside slavery for that excuse to deserve respect. Men who could buy children, separate mothers, mortgage bodies, and still kneel in church on Sunday were not halted by conscience in the middle of a public sale. They were halted by risk. That is the word that matters. Risk to inheritance, risk to reputation, risk to paper. Because in the slave South, ownership was never just possession. Ownership created records, and records, when aligned correctly, could become evidence. Once Eliza Bell stepped onto that platform and 3 leading families recognized something in her face, the sale stopped being a purchase and became a trap. If Augustus Rothwell bought her, he would have to take legal possession. If Judge Nathaniel Mercer bought her, he would have to place her somewhere under household authority or estate control. If Henri St. Clair bought her, her transfer would leave a trail through business accounts, domestic assignments, or plantation ledgers. Any of those paths could reopen the old timeline. Rose Duval, the vanished woman from 1842. The unnamed childbirth in August 1843. The years of concealed movement. The suspicious avoidance of Savannah households afterward. This is why the room changed when Eliza smiled, not because the smile was magical, not because the rich suddenly turned sentimental, but because the smile confirmed recognition, and recognition made every future signature dangerous. The slave market ran on paper as much as violence. People remember chains because chains are visible. They remember the platform because spectacle leaves a mark. But the system endured because clerks wrote, judges approved, traders filed, ministers blessed, and families stored their lies in drawers. A girl sold without scandal became inventory. A girl sold under the gaze of 3 frightened families became a liability. Consider what a completed sale would have required: a bill of sale naming seller and purchaser, a transaction date, a declared value, in some cases a notation of condition or intended use, possibly a transport record if she were moved, possibly a household inventory entry if she entered domestic service, possibly clothing allowances, medical expenses, or food accounts. Possession sounds simple to people who do not study systems of ownership. It is not. Possession leaves residue. And residue is what guilty families fear most. If Rothwell purchased Eliza, then rival men in Savannah would notice. A merchant of his standing did not buy a girl at an inflated price without the city asking why she mattered. If he placed her in a townhouse, servants would talk. If he moved her out to a secondary property, drivers and overseers would talk. If he resold her too quickly, that would talk even louder. Rich families depended on silence, yes, but silence in cities like Savannah was never empty. It was crowded with clerks, coachmen, seamstresses, wet nurses, cooks, cousins, creditors, and wives. One wrong purchase could animate all of them. Mercer's position was even more precarious. A judge did not merely possess property, he embodied law. That was his public value. If Nathaniel Mercer bought Eliza Bell after visibly reacting to her face, then every later decision involving her would be shadowed by the possibility of motive. Suppose she fell ill, suppose she disappeared, suppose she were sent inland under another name. Each move would look less like ordinary slaveholding cruelty and more like concealment. And Mercer, of all men, could not afford concealment to become visible. A man who lived by certifying legitimacy could not openly possess the living outline of an illegitimate past. St. Clair had a different problem. His reputation could absorb vice better than Mercer's or Rothwell's. A planter with money was allowed a wider field of ugliness so long as the ugliness stayed ordinary by Southern standards. But even St. Clair could not easily explain why he would buy a girl who caused Rothwell and Mercer to freeze at the same moment. That kind of synchronized fear changes the meaning of acquisition. It suggests prior knowledge. Prior knowledge invites investigation. Investigation is what men of appetite fear most when they have mistaken custom for immunity. And there was another reason they stopped. Buying Eliza would not only expose the buyer, it could provoke the other 2 families to protect themselves by turning on him. That is how alliances under corruption really work. People imagine elite secrecy as stable, almost brotherly. It is not. It is conditional. Men cooperate while silence benefits all of them. The moment one man seems likely to secure exclusive control over a dangerous piece of evidence, the others begin calculating betrayal. If Rothwell bought Eliza, Mercer and St. Clair would have to wonder whether he meant to bury the truth or weaponize it. If Mercer bought her, the others might suspect he intended to absorb or alter records through legal authority. If St. Clair bought her, both Savannah families might fear she would be taken beyond city reach and handled too decisively to monitor. In other words, purchase created imbalance, and imbalance threatened the one thing that had preserved them since 1842, shared uncertainty. As long as no one family openly possessed Rose Duvall's surviving evidence, no one family could fully dictate the narrative. That stalemate may have been ugly, but it was stable. Eliza's appearance endangered that balance. To buy her was to seize the center of the problem. To seize the center of the problem was to invite retaliation. That is why the auction stalled. Not because slavery suddenly met a moral limit. Slavery had none. It sold infants, branded men, raped women, split marriages, and called all of it law. No, the sale stalled because three wealthy houses looked at one another and realized ownership might trigger confession. There is a habit in sanitized history of describing moments like this as awkward, tense, or socially complicated. Those are cowardly phrases. The truth is clearer. This was a panic event, a controlled upper-class panic event wrapped in posture and silence, but panic all the same. The people in front of that platform were not witnessing a graceful withdrawal. They were witnessing fear in expensive clothes. The auctioneer, Silas Wainwright, must have understood this at once, even if he did not know the full history. Men in his trade learned to read the room faster than priests. He would have recognized the signs: bids climbing too fast, then dying too sharply, eye contact not with the lot, but between families, whispers among wives, a judge refusing to continue where greed should have led him onward. Wainwright likely kept speaking because traders always speak through instability. Their profession depends on pretending a human crisis is merely a market fluctuation. But by then the issue was beyond his handling. The crowd sensed something. Not the whole truth. Crowds almost never get the whole truth in the moment. But they sensed that the interruption was not about price. Savannah's people knew how rich men behaved when they wanted something. They knew stubborn bidding wars. They knew vanity purchases. They knew men ruining one another for public victory. This was different. Here were three houses with money enough to continue, and none willing to do it. That alone turned rumor into structure. Some likely assumed the girl was diseased. Others may have guessed a hidden defect, a legal dispute, a prior claim. But the sharper observers would have noticed the real clue. The families were not recoiling from Eliza's body. They were recoiling from her face. That distinction matters. A bodily defect lowers value in market logic. A face tied to memory threatens the market itself. Because memory creates lineage, and lineage is where slaveholding society lied most aggressively. White Southern families obsessed over blood in public while polluting their own bloodlines in private through coercion, assault, and denial. Then they treated the resulting children as the shame of the mother, never the crime of the father. That inversion was not accidental. It was the moral grammar of the plantation world. It allowed respectable men to create human consequences and then pretend those consequences came from nowhere. Eliza Bell was one of those consequences, and consequences become especially dangerous when they age into visibility. A hidden infant can be moved, a young child can be renamed. An adolescent girl with her mother's expression and perhaps another family's bone structure is harder to manage. By 16, resemblance settles. Mouths begin repeating, eyes start carrying old accusations. Even posture can betray a lineage polite society refuses to speak aloud. That is why so much of slavery's domestic secrecy focused on early removal. The powerful understood something they rarely wrote plainly. Children become harder to erase once they begin to look back. What happened in Savannah in 1859 was not just about an old secret resurfacing, it was about timing. The girl had reached the age at which concealment becomes unstable, too old to be unformed, too visible to be accidental, too publicly presented to be quietly redirected without anyone noticing the strain. So they chose the lesser danger. They chose not to buy. That decision, too, was an act of violence. Do not mistake non-purchase for restraint. Refusing to bid did not save Eliza. It merely changed the method by which powerful people protected themselves. Whether she would be delayed, rerouted, sold through another channel, or hidden again, her fate remained under the shadow of white fear. The difference is that now the fear had spoken publicly through silence. The room had seen it, and once a secret forces the rich to break character in public, the secret is no longer fully buried. This is also where we should be honest about the deeper obscenity. Under slavery, even a black girl's danger had to become useful before white society would notice it. Eliza's suffering alone would not have stopped that auction. The probable suffering of Rose Duval had not stopped anything in 1842 or 1843. What paused the machinery was the threat to white houses. That is one of the ugliest lessons in the record, and one worth remembering. Systems of oppression often ignore the wound until the wound starts bleeding onto the people who made it. The bids ended because buying Eliza Bell would have produced documents. Documents would have invited questions. Questions would have aligned dates. Dates would have led backward, to Rose, to the hidden birth, to the transfers, to the overlapping households, to the gentlemen of Savannah who built their world on the assumption that black women could be used and forgotten without return. But history does return, sometimes not through courts, sometimes not through graves, sometimes not through confessions, sometimes through a face on an auction block, and 3 wealthy families too frightened to lift their hands again. That is why they stopped bidding. Not mercy, not pity. Not sudden shame, just fear, cold, practical, inherited fear, that one bill of sale might unravel 17 years of lies. The clean version of Savannah's past begins to collapse when 3 separate traces are forced into the same frame. A sermon note, a physician's ledger, a grave without a name. Each one, on its own, could be dismissed by people trained to protect old families. A loose religious remark, they would say. An ambiguous medical account, a cemetery irregularity common to the period. That is how respectable denial works. It breaks evidence apart until each piece looks too small to matter. But slavery was not maintained by isolated acts. It was maintained by patterns. And when those patterns begin repeating across paper, property, and memory, the lie starts losing shape. The first trace sits in the private notebook of Reverend Josiah Pike, a Baptist minister who served between the Savannah outskirts and nearby rural congregations from 1841 to 1850. Pike was not a radical abolitionist. Let no one sanitize him into a hero too quickly. He preached inside a slaveholding world and benefited from its order more than he openly challenged it. But men like Pike sometimes left behind useful moments of moral discomfort, especially when sin came too close to the houses funding their pews. In a sermon draft dated January 7, 1844, written several months after the suspected birth of the unnamed child, Pike scribbled a line in the margin that deserves far more attention than polite history usually gives it. The sin of men who share in flesh but not in truth shall visit their houses until memory itself testifies. That is not ordinary pulpit language. Southern ministers in the 1840s knew how to speak vaguely about lust, vanity, drunkenness, and pride. But this line is more pointed. Share in flesh, but not in truth. That sounds less like generic adultery and more like concealed sexual exploitation tied to denial. Shall visit their houses. That suggests consequences entering the domestic sphere, not merely personal guilt. Until memory itself testifies. That is the most striking phrase of all, because it implies a truth too buried for court and too dangerous for open naming, yet still capable of returning in visible form. A child can do that. A face can do that. A resemblance can do that. Pike never named Rose Duval in the surviving draft. He never named Augustus Rothwell, Nathaniel Mercer, or Henri St. Clair either. Ministers rarely wrote themselves into direct conflict with the wealthy unless they were prepared to starve. But context matters. Pike's wife, Martha Jane Pike, appears in the peripheral chain around the hidden infant in late 1843. Dinah Freeman's birth entry points toward a concealed delivery in August 1843. And now, in January 1844, Pike writes of men who share in flesh but not in truth. That is not courtroom proof, it is moral corroboration. A preacher close enough to the edges of the story had seen enough to become careful on paper. The second trace is colder. It belongs to Dr. Elias Pemberton, whose account books survive in fragments from 1842 through 1845. Pemberton was one of those physicians whose profession sat too comfortably beside slavery. He treated fevers, infections, childbirth complications, injuries, and private disorders in households that required discretion more than healing. Southern medicine liked to call itself science while serving power. Doctors were often the only men permitted into intimate spaces without social scandal. That made them guardians of secrets whether they deserved the role or not. In Pemberton's ledger for July 19th, 20th, and 22nd, 1842, the same initials appear. R.D. The notes are clipped. Recurring weakness. Agitation. Rest required. No household staff present. Then a final notation. Visits to continue if arrangement holds. Arrangement. That word is filth wrapped in neutrality. A physician does not describe ordinary domestic treatment as an arrangement unless the patient's location, status, or reason for care is being managed outside normal household patterns. If this were simply a sick, enslaved seamstress in her assigned residence, there would be no need for such language. But Rose was not being treated in any clear primary house. She appears connected to a leased cottage property indirectly tied to Henri St. Clair's network. Household staff absent, discretion implied, arrangement ongoing. It reads less like healthcare and more like maintenance of a problem. By September 1842, Pemberton's ledger contains a payment entry routed through a commercial intermediary associated with Rothwell's office, rather than through an individual household account. Again, that is not impossible. But when a physician treating a hidden woman receives money through business channels linked to a second elite family while the woman herself first appears in records tied to a third, the shape becomes hard to ignore. Rose Duval was not drifting. She was being handled, and people who are being handled are usually dangerous to someone. Then comes the third trace, the grave without a name, south of the older burial grounds used by Savannah's black community, beyond the better marked sections and closer to the rough, neglected earth that white caretakers rarely documented carefully. Later testimony points to a narrow burial patch disturbed in the mid-1840s and remembered by older local black residents as the place of the fine-featured woman with no kin called. The memory is secondhand by the time it surfaces in surviving notes from the 1870s, but it aligns too closely with the pattern to dismiss lightly. No proper stone. No clear church burial. No formal family acknowledgement. Just a woman buried without name in a place outside the moral concern of the city that used her. This is what slavery did best. It denied the dead the dignity of completion. A white wife died and received notice, prayer, fabric, carriage, and scriptural assurance. A black woman tied to elite scandal disappeared into dirt and rumor. That contrast should not be softened. It tells you exactly which lives the social order was built to honor, and which lives it was designed to erase even after death. The likely timing of that unmarked burial matters. If Rose Duval did not die in 1842, as later whispers claimed, and if the concealed birth occurred in August 1843, then a burial sometime in late 1843 or early 1844 would fit the theory that she survived long enough to deliver the child and then was removed permanently once her usefulness ended or her continued existence became intolerable. There is no need to pretend certainty where the guilty worked hard to destroy it, but there is also no virtue in cowardly doubt. Too many writers hide behind, "we can never know," when what they really mean is, the dead were black, the powerful were white, and the archive was built to protect the powerful. We can know enough to accuse honestly, enough to recognize method, enough to refuse the old shelter of ambiguity. Put the three traces together. In August 1843, an unnamed mother delivers a girl child before dawn under secrecy and indirect payment. By late 1843, a preacher's household seems to receive a brown infant under instructions of silence. In January 1844, Reverend Pike denounces men who share in flesh but not in truth. In Pemberton's records, Rose Duval had already been treated discreetly in July 1842 under a suspicious arrangement with no clear household accountability. Somewhere near the black cemetery margins, a fine-featured woman is buried without proper name or record. That is not random noise. That is a system tightening around a woman and then dropping her into obscurity. And what lies at the center of it? Lineage. That is the word respectable Southern memory hates most when black women are involved. Lineage was everything to families like the Mercers, Rothwells, and St. Clairs, so long as it could be claimed publicly, whitened legally, and sanctified through marriage, probate, and church ritual. But hidden lineage was another matter. Hidden lineage threatened distribution of property, the moral pose of white wives, the legitimacy of heirs, and the fantasy that power descended cleanly through honorable men. If Rose Duval bore a child linked to one of these houses, that was already dangerous. If more than one family had reason to fear the child's existence, through paternity, facilitation, concealment, or financial handling, then the danger spread across the city's upper structure. That is why one smile from Eliza Bell in May 1859 could stop 3 families at once. The sermon had warned that memory itself would testify. The ledger had recorded the concealed care. The nameless grave had marked the cost. Eliza was the testimony. This also clarifies the function of the preacher. Josiah Pike may not have known every detail, but he knew enough to sense rot at the center of respectable households. Clergy and slave societies often served as moral janitors, sweeping filth into theological language instead of naming it directly. But even that tendency betrays them. When a preacher writes about men sharing in flesh but not in truth, he reveals not just sin, but local familiarity with its pattern. He had seen too much to mistake this for an isolated moral lapse. He was brushing against a network, and the doctor, he represents another layer of the same corruption. Medicine, in such cases, does not heal. It manages outcomes for the strong. It stabilizes the body just long enough for arrangements to proceed. The physician records symptoms but avoids naming the social wound that caused them. That, too, is part of slavery's machinery. Pain becomes clinical. Violence becomes condition. Concealment becomes treatment plan. The grave completes the circle because it shows where the machinery ended, not in justice. Not in confession, not in repentance. In disposal. A woman used, hidden, monitored, delivered of a child, and then folded into anonymous ground while the men implicated in her disappearance kept their names, pews, offices, and dinner invitations. That is the moral order Savannah offered in those years. Not civilization, not honor, only hierarchy, carefully dressed. So when the city later tried to remember itself through architecture and manners, through polished tours and inherited silver, it depended on forgetting women like Rose Duvall. It depended on forgetting the unnamed mother, the discreet physician, the compromised preacher, the nameless grave, and the living child moved from county to county under borrowed labels. Do not forget them. Because forgetting is how the guilty win twice, once in the act and again in the memory of it. By the time Eliza Bell stood on that platform in 1859, the evidence was no longer confined to paper. Paper can be altered, sermons can be buried. Graves can be neglected, but a face seen by the right people at the wrong time can do what archives refuse to do. It can force recognition, and recognition is exactly what Savannah's finest families could not survive in the open. The sermon had warned them. The ledger had served them, the grave had concealed the cost. Then the daughter appeared, and all three lies began to fail at once. The official archive will never confess this story cleanly. That is where honesty has to begin. People raised on courthouse records, family Bibles, polished heirlooms, and respectable cemetery tours often expect the past to present itself like a sworn statement. They want a signature, a seal, a direct admission. They want guilt to announce itself in language comfortable enough for descendants to process without shame. But Savannah in the mid-19th century did not preserve truth for the sake of truth. It preserved status. And status survives by editing memory. So if anyone is waiting for a neat page dated May 14, 1859, declaring that Eliza Bell stood on an auction block and forced three of the most powerful families in coastal Georgia to recognize the same dead woman, that page will not come. Men with money rarely write down the worst thing they did in plain language. They fragment it. They route it through clerks. They push it into euphemism. They leave behind partial ledgers, altered dates, burial gaps, and silences so synchronized they begin to sound like testimony. That is what Savannah left, and it is enough, because the silence at that auction tells its own story. Three families arrived ready to bid. The Rothwells, the Mercers, the St. Clairs. They had money. They had motive. They had appetite. In any ordinary sale, one of them would have claimed the girl. Men like that did not lose nerve over price. They did not suddenly discover tenderness for a black child on a public platform. They had already lived too long off bondage for anyone to insult history with that fiction. Yet when Eliza Bell looked toward them and smiled, the bidding died. Not slowly, not ambiguously, it died at once. That reaction matters more than any single damaged record because it happened in public. Public reactions are costly. Powerful families train themselves for generations not to reveal fear where others can see it. They may commit crimes privately, but they guard expression like treasure. And yet on that day in Savannah, three houses with no reason to display weakness all exposed the same thing at the same time: recognition. Recognition of whom? Of Rose Duvall, almost certainly. The woman who moved through the edges of their records in 1842. The woman treated discreetly by Dr. Elias Pemberton in July 1842. The woman attached to household movement, hidden payment, and social instructions, not to mention her again in company. The woman whose likely childbirth in August 1843 had to be detached from name, place, and father. The woman whose death never settled honestly on paper because paper was being used to protect the living, not the dead. Eliza Bell was not merely a beautiful girl in a sale yard. She was the return of a suppressed sequence. She was the visible continuation of something all three families had helped bury in different ways. Maybe one provided the money. Maybe one provided the legal cover. Maybe one provided the property. Maybe one provided the blood. In systems like slavery, guilt rarely sits neatly inside one house. It travels through alliances. That is the point polite history resists most. It prefers isolated villains, a cruel master here, a corrupt traitor there. A predatory planter in one bad county. That version comforts descendants because it suggests evil can be contained to a few names and a few rooms. But what happened in Savannah points to something larger and truer. Slavery did not only function through individual brutality, it functioned through coordinated respectability. Merchants, judges, planters, wives, clergy, physicians, and traders all held pieces of the same moral collapse together. One managed the paper, one managed the law, one managed the flesh, one managed the silence. That is how a city keeps calling itself civilized while standing on human ruin. On May 14, 1859, that structure slipped. The auction did not expose the whole crime in words, it exposed it in behavior. And behavior is often more honest than archives. Archives can be edited. Behavior, when panic enters, becomes harder to discipline. A face appeared. Old memory rose. 3 wealthy families abandoned competition in the middle of a sale. That is not a misunderstanding. That is evidence in social form. And we should be plain about what kind of crime slavery actually was. It did not simply traffic labor. That phrase is too small. It trafficked wombs, names, parentage, inheritance, and truth itself. It made black women vulnerable to the appetites of white men, then denied those women credibility, safety, and memorial dignity. It turned children into assets while hiding the lines of paternity that might embarrass white households. It let elite families present themselves as guardians of order, while disorder of their own making was pushed into side buildings, remote cottages, and nameless graves. Then, when the consequences matured into visible human form, it tried to sell them away. That is what Eliza Bell represented. Not an interruption. An exposure. The system thought it had handled the matter back in 1842 and 1843. Rose Duval was removed from stable records. The child was moved under indirect care. Names were blurred, payments were routed, silence was instructed. Savannah's upper class did what upper classes always do when their crimes threatened inheritance. They turned logistics into morality and called the result discretion. But the truth kept growing. That is one of the few mercies history sometimes offers the dead. The crime may be organized, the paper may be corrupted, the city may cooperate in forgetting. Yet the consequence can survive longer than the lie. A daughter can live where a mother was erased. A face can remain where a name was stripped. A smile can become more dangerous than a legal claim. And that, in the end, is why the story refuses to disappear. Because Eliza Bell did not need a courtroom to accuse them. She did not need a Bible entry. She did not need a protected surname. She only needed to stand there alive long enough for the right people to betray themselves. Savannah likely spent years afterward doing what such places always do. Reframing, minimizing, redirecting. People would have called the incident a curious sale, a market irregularity, a misunderstanding, perhaps a dispute over title or health. Families would have pulled close. Wives would have watched what was said in parlors. Old letters would have been sorted, burned, or hidden. Clerks would have kept vague language intact. Those who knew fragments would have learned the oldest rule of survival near power: say less, live longer, and then time would begin its second violence. The first violence was the act itself. What was done to Rose Duval, what was done to the child born in secrecy, what was done to Eliza Bell on the platform. The second violence was memory management. Tour the city, praise the architecture, preserve the silver, recite the military names, and gradually remove the women who made the wealth possible and the children who exposed what the wealth actually cost. That is how civic innocence is manufactured, not by disproving guilt, but by curating attention. Do not accept that curation. Remember the dates. June 1842. Rose Duval appears in domestic transfer records. July 1842. Dr. Pemberton records discreet visits to R.D. August 21, 1843. A girl child is delivered before dawn. Mother unnamed. Late 1843. The infant is moved under silence. January 7, 1844. Reverend Josiah Pike writes of men who share in flesh but not in truth. May 14, 1859. Eliza Bell stands in Savannah, smiles once, and 3 founding families stop bidding. That sequence is the indictment. Not because every line is pristine. It is not. The guilty made sure of that. It is the indictment because the pattern is too consistent, the fear too synchronized, the omissions too strategic, and the social reaction too revealing. The archive does not need to confess in one perfect voice when all its fragments point toward the same buried structure. So what happened in Savannah on that May morning was not a sentimental scene about beauty silencing greed. It was a reckoning, however brief, between power and the life it thought it had already erased. Eliza Bell was not merely another enslaved girl displayed for sale. She was the surviving proof that old crimes do not stay where powerful men leave them. They move through blood, through faces, through daughters, through whispers, through pauses in public rooms. And here is the lesson worth keeping, because history is wasted if it is only consumed and not remembered rightly. A city can decorate its cruelty. A family can inherit its lies. A church can bless a silence. A court can dignify theft. A ledger can bury a woman under abbreviations. But none of those things can make the crime innocent. Savannah tried to forget Rose Duval. It tried to rename Eliza Bell. It tried to keep 3 great houses standing above the truth. For one moment on May 14, 1859, that effort failed. The girl smiled, the families froze, and the past, which had been ordered into silence for 17 years, stepped into daylight wearing a human face. Before you go, subscribe and comment with your location below. Then tell me your theory. Whose daughter was Eliza Bell really? And which of those 3 families had the most to lose if the truth ever reached daylight?